A lot of people come to the United States for economic stability. And when they get to the United States, they may be a little bit disappointed with what they get. Sometimes it's not as stable financially as they had imagined. My father, he spent 3.5 years in prison in former Yugoslavia. He was imprisoned because he refused to work on the Sabbath and refused to bear arms. And as a result, he was imprisoned. And when he miraculously got out of prison, he actually got sick. He got meningitis while he was in prison, and they discharged him to go home. And he went home to die, basically. And when he got home, he decided to dig a well for his mother before he dies. And in digging the well, he saved himself. The digging the well part ended up getting him to recover. Before he got married, he had heard about a dream of a land of liberty. And he wanted to come to that land of the United States. And he found out that there was something called a green card lottery. And he applied for this green card lottery. And some years later, he got married, had 2 children, and they let him know that he had he got the lottery, and he can go to the United States. And so I was only 2 years old, and we boarded a ship. We couldn't afford airplanes. We boarded a ship. It was a cargo ship, but had some passengers on the board. And we were some of the passengers, and he boarded in Croatia. We went up over to Venice, went down around Italy. I think we went to France, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and over into Lisbon, Portugal, and from Lisbon across to New York. While we were going across, my dad noticed somebody on board the ship, one of the people, one of the crewmen. And he recognized him as his chief persecutor, the person who gave him the hardest time while he was in prison for the faith. And my dad, he kept quiet on board the ship. He was quiet there on board the ship. And one day, he saw an airplane circling above. And then they saw the American flag go up. And he knew he was in the American waters. And when he saw the American flag, he went to the individual there and he says, "Do you remember me?" The man got terrified. He thought, now he's in America, he's going to do something bad to me. And as soon as the ship docked in New York Harbor, he disappeared. He was not going to be seen. And from there, we took a bus and we went to Sacramento, California. And so this land of liberty, with all of its problems that you may have here, it's still the greatest country on earth. I have traveled in many different countries. I have lived in a couple. I have visited for length of time in some other places. And I really appreciate when it's coming back to the United States. The liberty that we have. And again, if you are looking only economically, then you may be disappointed with economics. Okay, there may be disappointments that you may have if you have other type of goals in life. But when you're in prison for 3.5 years, you appreciate coming here, and you can express your faith in whichever way that you would like to. And the question that we have is, what does the Bible say about its future role, and even in world affairs? Now, before we go into the United States itself, I do need to cover, just briefly from what we covered a little bit this morning, about some of the points. We recognize that in Bible prophecy, we're not going to read all these verses, but we read this morning, that in Daniel 7, the fourth beast is the fourth kingdom. And therefore, in the Bible, when we're talking about beasts in Bible prophecy, this is speaking about kingdoms. And so beasts are civil or political powers. Sometimes they're connected to an ecclesiastical structure. In the previous study, we looked at Revelation 13, 1 to 10, and we noticed a beast that has the appearance of a leopard. And we find certain similarities as we looked at Daniel chapter 7. We saw that this beast, it was looking like a leopard, the feet of a bear, the mouth as a lion, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And from the study of Daniel 7, which you will look in the fourth in this series here, we find the beast represents certain nations. We find, of course, the very first one that is mentioned in the book of Revelation, not in the order in Daniel 7, but the leopard-like, it was the main characteristic of Greece, which was the philosophy of Greece. And therefore, this beast in Revelation 13, it has the appearance of a Grecian beast, so therefore the philosophy of Greece would be something specific there. We saw also the viciousness of Medo-Persia, and specifically we can see the infallibility. The Medo-Persian laws had the infallibility. The lion's mouth, it had the wealth and religious activities. It is to basically speak like Babylon. And of course the dragon, which was Satan using the power of Rome, which gave this beast its seat, which is the city of Rome, as its capital. And from our study of church history, comparing it with the Bible prophetic interpretations, we find that this representation of the civil and religious power vested in the Roman Catholic Church. We understand that the Roman Catholic Church is not just a spiritual, it's not just a religious power. Some years ago, I was visiting London, and the Pope had just visited London before I had been there. And the people on the radio were complaining because the government had spent so much money to protect and give the security to a religious leader. And I thought to myself, well, they didn't do it as a religious leader, they did it as a head of state. And eventually somebody mentioned that on the radio, that this is a head of state. It is the smallest country in the world, the Vatican City, but nonetheless it is it's still a civil government. That's why it is referred to not just as a religion, but as a beast or as a nation. And we looked earlier this morning, obviously it began in 538 AD until 1798. That was the 42 months or 1260 years. And so you have the 42, 30 days is in the Jewish calendar, times 42 is 1260. So if you add 1260 to 538 that we looked at this morning, it comes to the year 1798. And at the end of the 1260 years, in 1798, the papacy was led into captivity. Pope Pius VI was taken captive by the French general Berthier, and the following year, August 29th, 1799, he died. And in Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, it says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." So this was the wounding to death of that wound that the head had received, which was in the year 1798. And although the Roman Catholic Church continued to exist in its spiritual role, the relationship with earthly powers definitely received a deadly wound. And that was represented by the deadly wound in the dragon's head. However, that deadly wound will be healed, and that will leave for another topic, another time. But now we come to another nation. In Revelation 13, verse 11, the next verse, it says, "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth." Okay, so here is another what? Another nation, because beast is a nation. So here is another nation coming up. And again, in this context, it would be in 1798, because the previous verse shows the papacy was taken captive, and now in this time frame, there is to be another nation. So when it says coming up, it does not mean that the nation begins in 1798, but rather that it was already in existence. You see, if you have the example there, coming up, for example, if I'm down here, and then if I'm coming up, it means what? I'm just now in the process of what? Of getting up. And so it means that this nation was already in existence, but that it would be a young nation. It would have to be a young nation. So when we look in 1798, we have to look for a young nation at that time to fulfill this prophecy. It's interesting, John Wesley, the great Methodist preacher, he explained, he says, "He is not yet come, though he cannot be far off, for he is to appear at the end of the 42 months of the first beast." So recognizing, it's not that far. We're in this 42-month period of time. We're in this period. We're going through this time frame. And soon after that, we are to expect this nation. And this nation is different. If you look in Daniel 7, you see a lion. Okay, a lion is a carnivorous animal. Okay, you see a bear. A bear is a carnivorous animal. You see a leopard, a carnivorous animal. A dragon, by that description, is very carnivorous as well. Okay, and now you have one coming up like a lamb, a totally different character to all the other nations. When you think of a lamb, what do you think of? A description of Jesus in Isaiah 53 says he was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to a slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. So you have here, again, you have here a lamb is more placid. It is not an animal like a lion, for example. If you come up to a lion, he's not going to be very placid. This is a very placid animal here. So a lamb is a very peaceful animal. Even when he's taken to a slaughter, he opens not his mouth. The lamb, when you look in the Bible, is more of a trusting type of an animal. Okay, in Jeremiah 11, verse 19, "But I was like a lamb or an ox that is brought to the slaughter. I knew not that they had devised devices against me." Okay, so he's being brought to the slaughter, and he has no clue that this is happening. Now, when we go back to verse 11, it says, "And I beheld another beast or nation coming up out of the earth." Okay, remember the first one was coming up out of the sea. This one here is coming up out of the earth. The sea, we read this morning in Revelation 17, verse 15. "The waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples." Excuse me. The waters which thou sawest where the horse sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So here is, water is a symbol of a very populated area. And so when it says here that this beast is coming up out of the earth, he's going to be different. The others are coming out of the sea with winds blowing, and most nations are created in large populated centers amidst great wars and struggles with a great loss of life. And this one here would be quite different from the other nations. It would be formed away from the waters, away from the great population centers of the world, in a land sparsely populated, not controlled by any national government. That's what you're looking for. And so this indicates that the nation coming up out of the earth did not come into existence through conquering other nations. That's not the character of this lamb. So when we're looking for this nation to come into existence, you definitely cannot look for it in Europe. Europe would not be the place to look for this because it was full of populated areas. It was quite a place with nations already in existence. You could not look for it in Asia, okay, or Africa, or the Middle East, because these were populated quite early in the history of the world. If a new nation wanted to come there in one of those areas, it would have to remove somebody. It'd have to conquer someone to get them out of the way. And for this reason, the only place that we can look to is the New World. You cannot look at it in any of those other countries. So in 1798. And as we look through the history, even in the New World, if you look in South America, you find the Incas. And the Incas were actually conquered in 1532 to 1533. That's when the Inca nation was conquered by the Spanish. But they were not in existence in 1798. There was no Incas. They were not there at that time. The rest of South America after 1533 became a colony of Spain. It was not, or Spain or Portugal, but it remained as a colony for all these years. So in 1798, it was not looking at some kind of a freedom. In Central America, in the place that we now call Mexico, you had the Mayan Empire and the Aztec Empire. And in the year 1521, the Aztecs were conquered. The Mayans were a little bit more scattered abroad, so they did not have one central government to conquer. And so that took longer. It did start in 1524, and the final Mayans were not conquered until 1697. Still, that's 100 years before 1798. So you still cannot look at that area there. And these great nations were without their power as soon as the Spanish explorers came there. And again, this was a long time before 1798. If you go to North America, we find a lot of scattered Indian tribes. Most of them were migrating from one settlement to the other. They did not have any form of central government. They had a tribal government. When the United States did start its existence, there was one, I think his name was Tecumseh. He tried to unite the Indian nations together to form some type of a rebuttal to the American expansion, but they were divided among themselves. And Tecumseh, he did have some success, but then they were so divided that there was no central government there. And so as we look back, obviously, even on these nations, none of them had any strength regarding world matters, especially when you look to 1798. And they were both, all these nations, the tribes here, they were swallowed up in what we call the United States and Canada. And so we have these two nations left to look at. You have the Canada and the United States. Canada until 1982 actually was a Commonwealth power under Great Britain. It did not get its independence till 1982. And so that again is not 1798, because we have to look at 1798 is the key part, that it is a young nation. And of course, Canada does not fill the qualifications for that, so it leaves us with the United States. So the question that we have is verse 11 speaking of the United States of America? If we look at the history of the United States, more than 250 years, 250 years was since the Declaration of Independence. The United States was colonized in the mid-1500s to the 1700s. When I was living in Maryland, they were celebrating their 350th anniversary. Okay, so many years, before that. During this time, the people who later formed the United States moved through the vast wilderness of the eastern part of the continent. Starting out in the east, they started moving back across. And by the year 1776, these peoples were in 13 colonies. And on July 4th, this day, 250 years ago, they signed their Declaration of Independence from European Great Britain. The war that followed was not a war of conquest. The war that they had was a war of defense. Over the years, the United States was reluctant for many years to get involved in other people's wars. They tried to avoid that. Even during World War I and World War II, it was hard getting the United States involved in some of those wars. They did get involved in a war earlier, but a lot of opposition was to that because it was a war of conquest, and they didn't want to be. And America actually became a colonial power for a period of time. That's how Philippines became a colony of the United States. But it was something that was against the ideals of the peoples here. And now, again, the Indians that lived here, they were not a nation. They were tribal people. Yes, sometimes they say they were the nation, but as far as nations are concerned, they didn't have such a government as such. So when we look at the United States, we find that on the bleak New England shores, these two principles of Protestantism and republicanism struggled for existence. And these two went in hand. The Protestant principles and Republican principles of government were the things that went together. Historians recount the hardships of having the sea, braving the sea and making new homes, but these were light trials compared with the soul strivings against bondage and oppression. So these people, they came from other countries where they were being oppressed. Even Catholics found safety in the United States. You have, when Mary was Queen of England, of Britain, she was very evil towards Protestants and persecuted many Protestants. When she was out, then the next queen, Elizabeth, came in, and they began just as fervently to persecute Catholics. And the Catholics fled England, and guess where they went? They came to the Americas, and they named the state after their queen. That's why you have Maryland. It's actually named after Queen Mary of England. And and you have the first diocese of the Catholic Church was in Baltimore. It's one of the oldest in the United States. Even they found liberty to come to this country. And so strongly ingrained were the principles of monarchy and the spirit to dictate in religious matters, the two foundation stones of the papacy, that only by dint of perseverance and strong determination on the part of a few souls who were open to heaven-born convictions, they gradually grew up in New England a representative form of government. And so the towns about Boston refused to be taxed unless they had a voice in the legislative body. And so this man here, Thomas Hooker, with his whole congregation, immigrated to the wilds of Connecticut for greater liberty. And as a result, the first written constitution ever known to exist in America was framed in the year 1633. So there they had the Constitution giving some of those rights. In Massachusetts, they were giving them a very hard time because of as far as religion. They changed it from being the Catholic Church, then it became the Church of England, and now the Puritans made it their church. And now you are required to go to church. And Roger Williams objected to that, and finally he was expelled. And he went to what is called now Rhode Island. And it was interesting, he had befriended the Indians, and so he had purchased a piece of land for them. And when they were able to come to freedom, they said, "It is by the providence of the Lord that we are brought here." And therefore they named the city Providence. And that's the capital of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island had an existence solely because of the attempt of man to oppress the conscience of his fellow man. And it stands in the Union today as a monument of the struggle for religious liberty. And that was the first place that had that. In the year 1787, the colonies adopted a constitution which united the colonies and was put into effect on March 4th, 1789. So the Continental Congress had met, and in 1787 they adopted the Constitution together with the Bill of Rights, and that was actually adopted finally on March 4th, 1789. When we take a look at the parts of the Constitution, in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution of the United States, it reads, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government." We need to understand that the United States never has been a democracy. The United States is not a democracy. A lot of people are wanting a democracy, and brethren, that is a dangerous form of government. People think democracy is a wonderful thing. I've lived in a democracy. In Australia. Australia is a democracy. And basically, whatever is the will of the people becomes the law of the land. And in the United States, it's not the case. In the United States, a republican form of government is a government formed by laws. And therefore, you have laws that you have to abide by even if the majority don't like the law. They have to then go through the process of changing the law. And it's not that easy to change the law, okay? You see a lot of things right now. Even the current president is trying to change certain things, and guess what? He can't, okay? He has the control of the legislature. He has the control of the Supreme Court. He has the control of the presidency, and they can't change things that easily. They still has to go through a process. Why? Because this is not a democracy. This is a republican form of government. I notice right now, even when we select a president, this is one of the few countries in the world that legally the minority can choose the president of the United States. People think that's terrible, but that's actually our protection. The whole idea is that you can elect someone to office as a minority. That's a guarantee that the majority is not always going to control things, and they're trying to change that today. The United States, with this form of government, a republican form of government that we have, and that's not Republican Party, that's not what it means. Republican is a type of government. Not everyone has equal voice in the government in the United States. California is the largest state in the United States. They have the largest number of representatives in the House of Representatives. Okay? But they have only 2 senators. They have only 2 senators. For the whole state, they have only 2 senators. Okay? You take a place like Alaska. They have only 1 representative in Congress. But they have 2 senators. You see. And again, that the way the government was formed was such so that will protect the minority. And when we're looking, when this is changed, when they're trying to change the way a president is elected to be by popular vote and doing everything like that, that's another step in ruling by popular vote. And if the popular vote says, let's kill Aldo, we all vote kill Aldo, then Aldo has to be killed. But the problem is Aldo right now can say, oh, but the law says you can't. Even if it's everybody here together says Aldo needs to be killed, yet the law says no, you cannot do that. Okay? And so that's why this is an important aspect, and therefore the United States shall guarantee every state in the Union the same Republican form of government. In Article 6, another very important thing, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Recently now they're saying, oh, the Constitution does not have a separation of church and state. Excuse me. It's very clear there that, number one, you're not going to have a religious test in the government here. And then in the First Amendment to the Constitution, because some of the states would not agree to the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. And Article 1 begins like this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is constitutional. This is part of the United States Constitution. And this is why, even during COVID, they tried to forbid the peaceful gatherings. Okay? And they said, you cannot have a peaceful gathering because of whatever. And the sheriff of one of the counties, our brethren talked to him, and he says, if the governor wants to do it, let him do it himself. But the Constitution guarantees the freedom of assembly. And this is very important for us. But these are things that are eroding little by little. And we'll understand why as we come to the end. These articles profess the amplest guarantee of civil and religious liberties, the entire and perpetual separation of church and state. And what better symbols of them could be given than 2 horns like a lamb? In what other country can be found a condition of things which would meet so completely this feature of a symbol? There is no other country in the world like this. And so that's when the 13 colonies were truly a nation. And therefore, when prophecy sees a nation just coming up in 1798, obviously a 9-year-old nation is clearly that nation. That is what it is. And so United States fits it perfectly. And, many people, as we look at when they came to this country, why is it that so many different people came? It's true, a lot of people are now coming here for economic reasons. But the main reason at the very beginning was clear. Among the Christian exiles who first fled to America and sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance were many who determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberties. Those 2 things went together, civil liberty together with religious liberty. They went hand in hand. To be able to have freedom as an individual in government as well as religious liberty. Their views found place in the Declaration of Independence, which sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, obviously, the freedom was not for everybody at the moment, okay? But understand, people forget that at that time, that was a major step, because in reality, prior to 1776, there was no freedom at all for anybody. Okay, you were a servant to the king. Okay, you're a slave to the king. You're not free. Okay, the king tells you, you got to come here, you got to come here. Whatever the king says, you got to do. Okay, so to take this step was a major step in the right direction. And so a lot of people look back and say, oh, but it wasn't complete. Well, sure, it wasn't complete. In the Bible, there wasn't things complete, okay? Even in the Bible, you had certain things that was not intended to remain that way forever. It wasn't the will of God, but it was a major step in their time. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer laws. So what you have, you elect representatives, and they then go and make laws and administer laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted. Every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of this nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. When we are looking at the power of the United States and the prosperity of the United States, we find that the prosperity of the United States was in republicanism and Protestantism. That is where its secret was. The secret where individuals can choose how they are governed, and the right to protest in religious faith, the right to believe your choice of beliefs. And as a result, the oppressed and downtrodden throughout Christendom have turned to this land with interest and hope. Millions have sought its shores, and the United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations on earth. The brightest minds ended up coming here. People who wanted to do things differently, they left their countries and they came to this nation. So now, again, keep in mind that in 1776, to possess civil and religious liberty was not heard of at that time. Today, we think that that is the norm across the world. It is not the norm. Okay? The rights that you have. I was living in Australia for 12 years, and one time I was driving through, and I got sick and tired of being pulled over. They do a breath test regularly, just constantly doing a breath test. And I told them, this is, you're taking away my rights. And the guy says, this is not the United States. You don't have rights. Okay. And it's true. Here you have to have a suspicion. Sometimes they make things up, I understand. They create a suspicion. But generally speaking, you're supposed to have a suspicion before you pull somebody over for that. To where no, that's not your right. That's too bad. Okay, and so during COVID, if you remember here in the United States, a lot of laws were trying to be enacted, and they had a hard time doing it. They could not enact all the laws that they wanted to. In Australia, they decided that you cannot leave your house for 182 days. They made that choice. Okay, you could not leave. In Victoria, you could not go more than 3 miles away from your home, and you had the reason to be outside. Okay, and if you were, you were fined severely. One person, they had just come from an overseas trip, and they came home, and they were told, okay, you have to isolate yourself. So anyway, he got in his kayak. And he got on his kayak and he went in the ocean. And he's on the ocean kayaking. And next thing you know, there's a police officer standing at the shore waving him in. And finally the guy came in Anyway, his neighbor said the guy left his house. And the police looked at him and they said, no, you come in, now you have to have a $1,000 fine because you're not in your house being isolated. Okay? Those are things unheard of in this country. Why? Because those are things that, these are our rights here. You see, in many countries, they receive things as a privilege, not as a right. Here in this country, this is my God-given right. And that's what the Declaration of Independence states, that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when we go to the book of Revelation again, in Revelation 13, verse 14, this is a unique situation because governments generally over the years had been governments that were ruled by the king. Notice Revelation 13, verse 14. And it deceived them that dwell on the earth, this is speaking of this new nation, by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had a wound by a sword and did live. Okay, so now, who is going to make the image to the beast? It does not say the government is going to make the image of the beast. But what? They that dwell where? They that dwell on the earth. Now, this is not talking about the world. Because remember, this beast came out of what? Out of the earth. So this is talking about people living in the United States. So this means that when the image to the beast is made, it is made by whom? By people. Or at least through the representatives, okay? So it's not going to be the government, the government as far as the monarchy or something of that nature. It's going to be people through the legislative branch of government. It's the legislature that is going to make the image of the beast. And again, this shows that there is the power to enact laws are through the legislative branch of government. Okay? So now, so it's saying that the inhabitants of the United States, they are the ones that have to make the laws. The power to decide laws was given then to the people, not to the rulers. And that means that this is the legislative branch of government that, again, did not exist, in other places like that. Yes, you had the legislative, you had some type of a legislature in England at the time, but it was still subservient to some degree to the king. And also that that this legislative branch of government is going to do what? It's going to make an image to who? To the beast. Okay, notice the verse here again that we read here. Revelation 13, verse 14. Saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast. Which beast? Which had a wound by a sword and did live. So the beast that we're talking about here was the papal system that received the deadly wound in 1798. And these people here are going to make an image to that beast. Okay? That means that these people are not Catholic. It's not a Catholic nation. Because if you're a Catholic nation, you don't need to make an image to the Catholic nation. Okay? So this shows that this has to be a non-Roman Catholic nation that exists. And again, this is another evidence that this is the United States. So now, there's a strange paradox here. Because at the very beginning, this nation was to speak like a lamb. And when you think of a lamb, you don't think of war and bloodshed or turmoil. You don't see anything of that nature. You would consider it peace and kindness, youth, innocence, gentleness in the way it treats its citizens and other nations. And of course, we saw it had lamb-like horns. But now, this nation does not remain lamb-like. Okay, it doesn't stay lamb-like. Notice what it says there in verse 12 in chapter 13. And he exerciseth what? All the power of the first beast before him. What does he do? Exercises the same power as the first beast. And what's one of the things that the first beast exercised? In verse 7, and it was given unto him to make war with the saints. So what are we to expect? So we're looking at the United States eventually to do what? To make war with the saints. That's what it's going to do. Okay? So what makes the change? Why does this nation change? Verse 15. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast. So first, he makes an image to the beast. And the beast, the first beast, Catholicism, how did it exist? The church controlled the state. The church controlled the state. Okay? And so, to give life unto the image of the beast, so once you make an image of the beast, there has to be the church controlling the government. Okay? And what is it going to do? It's going to give life to that. And then the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. This goes again into persecution. To think that religious persecution is going to happen in the United States, that is an anomaly. You see, so what you find here is that this nation that was more lamb-like in character is going to be more dragonic in character. And why dragonic? Because it is one of the heads. Okay, it's the seventh head. Okay, that's what it is. It is the seventh head. Okay, so again, when we say in prophecy that the beast, the United States, is to speak, what are we talking about? How does the nation speak? What are the words of the nation? Our country speaks through the legislative and judicial branches of government. In other words, Congress and the Supreme Court. And this is why it's so important to pay attention. And this last couple of weeks, I was paying attention to the rulings of the Supreme Court. Okay, you have the president says many things, and then the Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional, or says it is constitutional, one or the other. And recently, I think on the birthright citizenship, the Supreme Court, they had a 100-year-old decision already before, and so right after the Supreme Court said this, what did the president do? He appealed to Congress to change the law, okay, to change it, okay? Again, why? Because it's dependent on Congress and the Supreme Court. Those are two areas that you have to depend on. Even though, you know, the United States actually is one of the, there's not that many countries that actually give birthright citizenship. I was living in Australia, and I met somebody there. They had a baby in Australia. The baby was born in Australia, but that baby who was born in Australia is not an Australian citizen. And they have to leave the country because the parents were being expelled, and the child, that's not their country. Their country is wherever the parents come from. And the father at that time, he had just gotten his Italian citizenship. He was originally from Brazil, but he just got his Italian citizenship, so he got his child to get an Italian citizenship, okay, because he was from there. So, you know, not every country does that. But regardless of that, where was the voice? It was Congress and the Supreme Court that is actually making those decisions. So, although at the beginning these three parts of the government were defenders of liberty, so when you look at the experience of both Congress, in many cases, now obviously in some cases they were not. Okay, you have some decisions that were not, and some of them caused the Civil War. Why did it cause the Civil War in the United States? Because they were decisions that were not compatible with the Constitution. They were not constitutional. So even when the Supreme Court decided it was constitutional, it wasn't, and that was one of the things that created the environment for the Civil War. So this is why we need to be paying close attention to what these branches of government are saying, especially Congress and the Supreme Court. Sometimes we don't listen to all these things, but you can see where our liberties are going based on the decisions that they have. The prediction that it will speak as a dragon and exercise all the power of the first beast plainly foretells a development of the spirit of intolerance and persecution that was manifested by the nations represented by the dragon and the leopard-like beast. So what happens is it shows that the United States is going to have the same character traits of the dragon. They're a dragon head. And so even though in the beginning it was lamb-like, but as it goes on, the spirit of the dragon is carrying this beast in the end. The spirit of intolerance is fast coming into the United States. And the land of the free and the home of the brave is fast becoming a persecuting power upon the face of the earth. And you can see that. You can see that in recent things. Even with a recent war, there was no purpose to go to that war, okay? And so here you are, no wars have a purpose to it, okay? But this was really one that just didn't make sense. And you go out there and create problems. Why? That's not like America. That is very un-American to go into a war like that. Even without a pretext. There were other wars that they got into, but they tried to get a pretext for it. Okay, this one here had no pretext whatsoever. And so why will it persecute? What's the reason? Because the United States is not going to be an easy thing to make them do certain things against their will. The only way to do things against their will is persecution. Again, COVID was a good example. During COVID, the restraints in America was very difficult. And it was great. Some states you had absolutely freedom to do anything. I did a wedding in a state, and the reason they chose that state was because there was no restrictions at all. And we went there, no restrictions at all. You went there and we had a wedding. A lot of people came there, everything else like that. No problem to it. You had freedom to do that. And people had choices. They want to mask up, go mask up. You don't want to mask up, don't mask up. You want to be isolating yourself at home, go isolate at home. You don't want to isolate at home, don't go isolate at home. I was one of the non-isolators. Okay, I was walking freely among people, and one sister, she was really upset with me one day because it was her third time catching COVID, and her third time catching COVID, and I still hadn't gotten it. She said, "This is not fair. You're out there freely mingling with people, and you still don't have it." I said, "Don't worry, I'm in line. I'll get my chance, and I gave her a hug while she had COVID. I said, "I'll give you a hug here." See you. And she said, "This is not fair." And about 2 months later, I did get it. I got the worst strain that you had, but it was my choice. I could choose whichever way, to where a lot of places it wasn't. Now, that was just getting a trial, because people think for the sake of safety, we're going to give up our freedoms, you see. Now, what happens when they start really doing things? Because what's the purpose of it? What's the intolerance over? It says, "And deceiveth them that dwell in the earth," this is verse 14, "by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell in the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had a wound by a sword and to live." So, to make an image to the beast, it's going to require some force. It's going to have, the government is going to make a law. Yeah, the legislature will make the law, but it's still going to require some, because some will not comply together with it. And again, this is speaking of the leopard-like beast. And can that be that the United States is going to cause its inhabitants to worship the papacy? This is a really good question, you see. So, when we look at history, it was quite a challenge for the United States to elect the first Catholic president back in the 60s. And That was made part of the issue. And probably he got killed, probably because he promised not to allow the Catholic Church to influence his decisions. Now, can it be? How does it work? Well, when you look at the former president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, the Pope came down to Miami and the president went to go see him. Since that time, almost every president has gone there. I remember when John Paul II back in 1987 went to visit the Golden Gate Bridge, they practically shut it down at that time so that he can do whatever he needed to do there. And of course, every president since that time has gone to be with the Pope, to have some type of relationship with the Pope. Back in also 1987, the Pope was visiting the University of South Carolina, which is a very strong Protestant sector, and so many people came there to see him and participate with him. And we see that America is little by little going in that direction as before. The next question we'll have in our mind is, how can American people be blinded to accept such a change? Because Americans love their liberty. That has been something that has been, even people who move from other countries, they also love their liberty. They love the liberty that is here, okay? How do you get people who love their liberty to give up their liberty? And it's quite simple. In verse 13, it says, "And he doth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men." Whether this is fire coming down from heaven or it's with bombs or whatever else it's doing, obviously they're using miracles and they're using some type of power to do this. And that is what they use. Notice verse 14, "And deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of" what? Those miracles. And so many people are depending on miracles. They are totally dependent on a miracle to get them allowed to do various things. Edwin Burke, back in 1784, this guy, he was in the House of Commons, and he declared that people never give up their liberties but under some delusion. So first there has to be a delusion in order for a person to give up their liberties. And whether the delusion is COVID, you're going to die if you don't give up your liberties, and a lot of people just gave up the liberties just like this. After 9/11, how many people gave up their liberties? You know, I was traveling on the airports before 9/11 and after 9/11. And when I have time, I sometimes bother them. I said, I don't understand this. You know, this to me is more financial than anything else, because on this side of the thing, this bottle of water costs $1. On that side is $5. Okay? This has nothing to do with safety, okay? But people get under a delusion, and what are they willing to do? They're willing to give up their liberties. Benjamin Franklin, he was one of the founding fathers. He stated, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And how many people are prepared to do this? They are prepared just to have a little bit of safety. And if you tell people it's for your safety, oh, okay, I'll give up my liberty. Very quickly they give up liberty in order to get some type of an imaginary safety. And that's just amazing as we look at that. Daniel Webster, he states, "God grants liberty only to those who love it and are always ready to guard and defend it." You know, so first of all, we have to really appreciate the liberties. And I think a lot of people, even who come to the United States, they forget what it's like in some of their own countries, the liberty that they actually have here as a right. Sometimes you have the same liberty, and many countries I've traveled to, I had the same liberty as I had here, but you find out it's not a right. Okay, it's given to you as a privilege, and the government can withdraw it at any moment. They can just withdraw it like that. You know, I'm reminded of a story of a family that had gone to look at the sights of New York for the very first time. And they had visited many places, among them the famous Statue of Liberty. And a couple years ago, when I came back to the United States from Australia, I did promise my wife that I will let her, I want to hear Handel's Messiah at Carnegie Hall. And so one day we did go to Carnegie Hall to listen to Handel's Messiah. And we had a few days there in New York, and so we took the opportunity to go to Liberty Island, to the Statue of Liberty. And back in the early 1900s, I even found a couple names. There's a few Lausevics that came in. They're my grandfather's brothers that came in actually for a little while here to work, and then they went back to Montenegro and Bosnia. And it was wonderful to stand there at the Statue of Liberty. I tell you, it was a wonderful thing. When we came to the United States, they had just closed Ellis Island just before we arrived, and so we did not go to. We were not processed at Ellis Island. We were processed a little bit further down, and so it was amazing to stand there at the Statue of Liberty and see the wonderful things that this country stands for. And this little girl, after the exciting day, the little girl found it difficult to sleep. And the father said, "Why don't you go to sleep, honey?" And she replied, "Daddy, I'm thinking about that lady with the lamp out there in the dark. She's all alone. Don't you think we should be helping Miss Liberty to hold up the lamp?" And you know, that is a really important principle here. When we're looking as a nation, we're looking at liberty. Little by little, our liberties are going to be taken away. Are we watching for it? Are we preparing for it? Are we helping others to be defended on liberty? To help hold up the torch of liberty is the duty not only of one family, but of every true Christian throughout America and the world. And the question is, are you prepared to appreciate liberty the way you should be appreciating liberty? Are you prepared to do that? Because this is the foundational thing. Financial security is not secure anywhere. I know people come to this country for financial security, and I appreciate it. I've been to some poor places, and I don't know how they can live. Okay, I have no problem. You know, for them to come to America for financial resources, that's great. But the problem is you come here, and it's not that great, okay? Sometimes you're working harder than ever before. The issue here is the issue of liberty. That's the reason that I appreciate the country here. And may the Lord help us that we may all appreciate liberty more than ever before. And so our series has been America 250 and beyond. We can look back at what happened during the last 250 years. A lot has happened during these 250 years. A lot of developments towards freedom for different groups of people having the freedom they didn't have everywhere before. To have that today is a wonderful thing. But the future is not so wonderful, because we know that this very same nation is going to act like a dragon. And may the Lord help us that we be prepared to stand for the truth in these last days. Amen.